You know how some dates they become more than just numbers on a calendar.
Oh, absolutely.
They get etched into a people's collective memory, felt like the source we're looking at today says, as if it happened yesterday.
Yeah, they carry this enormous weight, don't they?
Yeah.
Instantly bringing specific places, specific events to mind.
They really do. They transcend simple chronology.
It's like they become these seismic events in a national consciousness,
Mm.
deeply embedded in the shared experience.
Reference points, almost, for understanding identity struggle.
And resilience, too. Definitely resilience.
And the source material we're diving into today, it brings up several dates and places like that, ones
Oh,
that hold this kind of powerful, enduring significance for Eritreans.
oh,
It lists November 30th and December 1st, 1970, then July 10th, 1974, February 2, 1975, and May 12th, 1988,
right.
and connects them to specific places: Besikdira, Ona, Wekiduba, and Shaib.
So not just dates, but date-place combinations loaded with meaning.
Exactly. The source frames them not just as dates, but as markers of difficult days, tied to difficult, traumatic events.
These aren't just historical data points, then. The source is emphasizing they represent documented instances of severe violence, right, affecting civilians.
Yes, each tied to a specific location and a moment of profound loss that's been, well, preserved in memory.
Got it.
And among these dates and places that are, as the source puts it, registered in the memory of the Eritrean public, young and old, one event stands out in the source
Okay.
as particularly significant, deeply remembered. And that's the focus of our deep dive today: the massacre that took place in Ona and Besikdira in late 1970.
Okay. So the article we're examining position the Ona and Besikdira events as like exceptionally important within this broader context of historical trauma.
Precisely. It highlights it as warranting specific attention, detailed remembrance.
Understood.
Our source for this deep dive is an article titled Remembering the Unforgettable Ona A.txt. The author is Simon Weldemikael. And this article, it doesn't just list these events, it really delves into their significance and, crucially, it reviews a key book that documents them in detail.
So it grounds the memory in historical research.
Exactly. It connects the memory to the documentation.
So we're not just looking at a historical summary here. We're looking at an analysis of how this history is being documented and remembered
Right.
through a specific publication, all as presented by this author, Weldemikael.
Yes, the article is our lens, really, into both the events themselves and the act of preserving their memory.
Makes sense.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to use this article to unpack the details of what happened in Ona and Besikdira, specifically as it's presented in the source material.
Right.
We want to understand the context the source provides for these, well, horrific events. Explore why remembering them is considered so vital today, according to the article.
And look at what the source suggests we can learn, maybe, about memory, history, documentation.
Exactly. And resilience, like you said. What are the core takeaways the source wants us to grasp about this particular moment and its lasting impact?
So going beyond just the facts, into the weight, the documented details, and the ongoing meaning, all through the framework of this specific article.
That's the plan. Okay, let's unpack this. The source starts by setting the stage, right? Establishing the broader historical landscape.
The context.
Yes, it frames these massacres, Ona and Besikdira, not as isolated incidents, but as, and I'm quoting here, just few instances of the merciless attacks on peaceful civilians.
Right. Carried out by the Ethiopian army during that period, according to the source.
Yes, that framing is crucial.
Absolutely. It tells you straight away the source sees this as part of a larger systematic pattern of violence targeting civilians, not some kind of aberration.
It places this specific tragedy within a context of, well, widespread suffering as described in the article. And the article really emphasizes the enduring nature of the memory across the entire population. It says these dates and the atrocities are registered in the memory of the Eritrean public, young and old.
That phrase, registered in the memory, it's quite strong, isn't it?
It is.
Suggests it's not just, like, forgotten history, but actively held, almost formally recorded in people's minds across generations.
And the young and old part underlines that. It's presented as a continuous thread, passed down, felt keenly, even by people maybe not born yet when it happened.
Speaks to a profound intergenerational impact, then.
It certainly seems to suggest a history deeply embedded in cultural identity. The source briefly lists those other dates and locations we mentioned earlier: Wekiduba, Shaib.
Right, to show the wider pattern.
Exactly. It does this to underscore the point that while Ona and Besikdira are the focus here, these events were part of a wider series demonstrating the pattern the source describes.
So including that list broadens the picture. Even though the narrative zooms in later, the source makes sure you understand this wasn't isolated.
Right. It was, according to the source, part of a more pervasive experience of violence across the region during that time.
Makes sense.
But then, the source intentionally pivots back, makes it explicitly clear why Ona and Besikdira in 1970 are being singled out.
Okay, why?
It describes these particular events as one of the worst instances of mass killing in Eritrean history.
Wow. Okay. Highlighting it as one of the worst really tells you the level of severity and trauma attached to this specific event in the narrative presented by the source.
It sets the stage for the detailed account to follow, justifies the intense focus on documenting and remembering it.
It's presented as a peak moment of suffering in this historical pattern, then.
Absolutely. So let's really zero in on Ona and Besikdira, specifically the events of November 30th and December 1st, 1970, as detailed in the source.
Okay.
First, location. The article places these villages few kilometers away from Karen.
Okay, so near a known town, not completely out in the middle of nowhere. That geographical anchor is useful.
It might make the events feel even more impactful or perhaps harder to conceal, given the proximity.
Potentially, yeah.
Now, the timeline presented in the source, specifically tied to the book it discusses, it starts slightly earlier than the massacres themselves. It says the sequence of events covered by the book began on November 21st, 1970, and concluded on December 1st, 1970, so a 10-day period.
And the source notes a specific event on that earlier date, November 21st.
Yes. It states this sequence began after Major General Teshome Erjitu, commander of the Ethiopian army in Eritrea, was killed.
Ah, okay. So the article explicitly links the killing of this military commander on the 21st
Right.
to the sequence of events over the following 10 days, culminating in these massacres.
Yes. It frames the subsequent violence against civilians within the context of this preceding event, implying, from the source's perspective, a potential connection, whether, strategic or retaliatory.
That connection is significant. It offers a lens, maybe, through which the source interprets the intensity and nature of what followed.
It positions the civilian massacres as potentially linked to military actions, though the focus remains squarely on the impact on the civilian population.
Understood.
So let's walk through the horrifying sequence as described in the source. Starting with Besikdira, November 30th, 1970.
Okay.
The article describes the arrival of Ethiopian troops. They entered the village.
Right. And then, according to the detailed account the source refers to, what happened?
A specific, brutal action. They rounded up its inhabitants and crammed them into a mosque.
Into a mosque. Wow.
Yeah.
That detail, using a place of worship, a sanctuary, to contain people before attacking them, that's particularly stark as described by the source.
It highlights a deliberate violation of a sacred space, adds a layer of cold calculation, doesn't it?
It really does. And the method of killing that followed.
Chillingly direct, as described. The source states the soldiers pointed their guns at the doors and windows of the mosque and opened fire, indiscriminately killing innocent civilians, including women and children.
Indiscriminately killing. That phrase is key. Emphasizes the targets were civilians, the entire population gathered there.
And the specific mention of women and children underscores that. This wasn't a military engagement described here.
No, an attack on defenseless villagers. The source uses language like bloodthirsty to describe the soldiers' actions, doesn't it?
It does, conveying the perceived motive and brutality. It says the blood spilled didn't seem to have satiated their desire for innocent blood.
And so they moved on.
Yes. On the following day, December 1st, 1970, the soldiers went to Ona.
A direct, immediate continuation of the violence from one village to the next, according to this narrative.
In Ona, the method was slightly different, but described as equally devastating. The initial action set the huts on fire.
So, destroying the physical structures, homes, shelters, not just killing people, but destroying the place itself.
Exactly. And then the source describes the killings. They gunned down people still inside the burning huts.
Oh my God.
But horrifyingly, it didn't stop there. The source states they also fired at and killed those who escaped from the fire.
That paints a picture of just, relentless cruelty. No possibility of survival presented.
Killed if they stayed inside, shot if they tried to flee the flames.
It describes a systematic effort, according to the source's account, to ensure no one survived the attack on Ona.
And the source connects these actions in both villages directly to a specific cold interpretation of the motive.
What's that?
It states the massacre was committed in conformity with Machiavellian advice on holding the conquered. There is no safe way to retain them otherwise than by ruining them.
Wow. That's a powerful analytical point the source makes.
It links the other destruction, the killing of families, burning homes, the looting.
Which the source knows they did. Looting.
Yes, hauling away anything of value. It
Yeah.
links all that to this ruthless political philosophy.
So the source interprets these actions not as random violence, but as a deliberate strategy. Conquest through absolute devastation of civilians and their way of life.
Ruining them. Completely. That's presented as the chilling rationale behind the described methods.
And the human cost. The numbers reported for just these two villages.
For Ona and Besikdira together, the source presents it starkly. 1,000 civilians were killed.
1,000. That number alone. It conveys the scale of the tragedy. A huge portion of a rural community.
And the source emphasizes the totality of the loss, stating that this figure included entire families.
That detail underscores it wasn't just individual casualties. It was the eradication of family units, the destruction of the social fabric itself as presented by the source.
That really drives home the point about ruining them, doesn't it? Not just reducing numbers, but dissolving the very basis of the community.
It does. So, considering those distinct methods described in the source, Besikdira with the mosque, Ona with the fire, and shooting escapees.
Yeah.
What does the source's description of these specific actions tell us about the nature of the attacks? And how does that Machiavellian interpretation frame it?
Well, the source presents two different yet complementary tactical approaches, right? To mass killing and total destruction.
Seems so. Containment and execution in Besikdira. Destruction of shelter and elimination of escapees in Ona.
Both methods, as detailed, appear designed for maximum civilian casualties. No escape, no survival presented.
And then the source overlays that Machiavellian quote, suggesting these brutal tactics weren't random cruelty,
Right.
but perceived, from the source's perspective, as deliberate tools. Tools of a strategy aimed at ruining the population so thoroughly they couldn't pose a future threat.
It frames the events as cold, calculated application of extreme violence for strategic control.
It certainly paints a picture of deliberate, systematic cruelty, not chaotic violence, based on this account.
That seems to be the core message the source intends to convey there.
Okay.
Now, while the source gives so much detail to Ona and Besikdira, it also makes it clear the book it's reviewing covers more ground.
Right, within that same time frame.
Exactly. The article lists other specific locations that, according to the source, are also covered by this book regarding atrocities during that November 21st to December 1st period.
Which locations?
It names Gireb, Dabrsina, and Habrinkeka.
Okay, so the inclusion of these other places in the book's scope, as highlighted by the source, that's significant.
How so?
It reinforces that initial point. While Ona and Besikdira were maybe the most horrific instances described, the violence wasn't isolated.
It affected a wider area. The book title mentions Senhit villages, right?
Exactly, suggesting a broader regional impact of these atrocities committed by the colonial army during that specific time frame, according to the source.
So the intense focus on Ona and Besikdira is perhaps due to the scale or nature there, but the source uses the book's wider scope to show this was a larger traumatic experience.
Shared by multiple communities in that region during that specific period, according to this account.
Which brings us to the book itself, clearly presented by the source as a crucial documentation, a vital vessel for this history.
The title.
The full title given is Osit Oedas. Ona and Besikdira, the Massacre of Senhit Villages from 1970 to 71.
Explicit. Naming the locations, calling it a massacre of Senhit villages, and the author is Netsereab Azazi.
Correct. And the source gives context for its release. It was inaugurated at the 54th anniversary event in Karen on Monday, December 2nd.
So, quite recently then, relative to the events, that grounds the book in a specific public act of remembrance.
Absolutely. The publication, the presentation, they're part of the ongoing process of memorialization the article discusses later.
It shows the effort to document and share this history is a long, ongoing process, tied to anniversaries, public acknowledgement.
And the source goes into detail about the author's research method, which it clearly views as making the book valuable.
How so? What did the author do?
It states the author interviewed survivors of the massacre, eyewitnesses, and a number of residents of the two villages and consulted secondary sources from the archives.
Okay, that's key. Combining first-hand accounts, survivors, witnesses, residents, with historical records from archives.
The source presents it as a rigorous, multifaceted approach.
And explicitly connects this blend of testimony and documents to the book's ability to provide accurate information and its credibility.
Yeah, it's presented as a ground-up history, rooted in personal experience but verified against records.
Makes sense. And the scope remained focused.
Yes, the source reiterates the book's focus. That timeline, November 21st to December 1st, 1970, and those locations, Ona, Besikdira, Jeleb, Debrecina, Haprinkeka.
Okay. Tight focus, broad research methods.
And the source praises the book's qualities beyond just the facts. It mentions the exhaustive research leading to accurate information, credibility,
Right.
but also comments on the presentation, saying the artistic presentation is attractive and readable.
So not intended as a dry academic report.
Seems not. And that the narrative evokes vivid images of the suffering of the innocent civilians.
So an effort to make it accessible, engaging, using presentation and narrative to convey the human impact, the emotional weight, making the history not just known, but felt.
That seems to be the idea presented. And the source views this book as having major significance, makes strong claims.
Like what?
It asserts the book refutes any sort of repudiation by historical evidence.
Wow, that is a powerful claim. It means the source believes the documentation is so solid, so compelling,
Right.
that it counters any attempts to deny or distort what happened, positions the book as providing irrefutable proof.
Gives it a definitive status, according to the source. It also states the book shows how 1,000 people, including entire families, died on those fateful days.
Directly linking the book's documentation to the scale of the reported tragedy, grounding the numbers, the details, in the research.
And the source highlights its important contribution in preserving history and promoting knowledge of Eritrea's experience during colonization.
So, framed as a crucial tool for historical preservation and education, within that specific national context of colonization, as the source puts it, essential for future generations.
And maybe the strongest endorsement, signaling its perceived importance, is calling it a must-read book for every Eritrean.
That's a declaration of fundamental importance, isn't it? It suggests the history within is considered essential knowledge for anyone identifying as Eritrean, integral to a shared understanding.
Thinking about the future aspirations for it, the source mentions a suggestion that it would be great if initiatives are taken to translate it into all Eritrean languages and international languages.
Okay, that's interesting. What does that ambition for translation imply about the perceived message the source thinks this book holds?
Well, it seems the source doesn't want this history to stay just within one linguistic or geographic boundary.
Right. All Eritrean languages suggests a wish for unification, a shared understanding across diverse groups within Eritrea.
That makes sense. And translating into international languages
Suggests the source believes the story, the lessons, are relevant globally. Elevates it from a local account to something with potentially universal significance. A history they believe needs to be known widely.
It really expands the perceived reach and message, doesn't it?
Definitely.
And the source notes this book isn't alone. It's the third book on atrocities published by Hatchery Publishers.
That's important context. Shows a larger, sustained commitment by this publisher to document these difficult events.
Right. The source mentions the previous two. Massacre at Wikidiba by Habtu Gebreb and Atrocity, a collection of short stories edited by Solomon Berhe.
So this book fits into a clear, ongoing program, memorializing these atrocities through documented accounts, literature.
A deliberate, multi-year effort, it seems, to record, publish, and make this history accessible, using different formats, too.
So why is the documentation in this book considered so important according to the source? What makes it crucial?
Well, based on the source's description, it seems to be several things. First, that research method combining testimony and archives yields accurate information that can refute repudiation. It's positioned as proof.
Right. Evidence against denial.
Second, it quantifies the scale. 1,000 killed, entire families, gives concrete shape to the horror. Third, it's explicitly positioned as preserving history and promoting knowledge within the national context during colonization.
Essential for identity and understanding, as presented.
And finally, that call for translation implies a belief in its broader significance, lessons for national and international audiences.
So grounding memory in evidence, providing proof, preserving history, and holding wider lessons. That seems to cover it.
And that call for translation, again, what message does the source believe it holds for a wider audience?
It strongly suggests the source sees universal implications, maybe about the nature of conflict, brutal conquest, human rights, or just the power of memory against erasure.
Right.
It indicates a belief that this specific history is part of a larger human story that needs sharing, learning from globally.
Elevates it beyond local history. Okay, shifting gears slightly. The article doesn't just focus on the events or the book.
Right. It also delves into the act of remembering itself, memorialization.
Exactly. Why and how the past is kept alive. The roles memory and commemoration play.
Okay.
The source identifies multiple purposes. It's a tribute to the fallen victims, obviously.
The most direct purpose, yeah.
But it also suggests memorialization is some sort of reparation or justice for survivors.
That's poignant. The act of remembering publicly, ensuring it's not forgotten, documented, that offers recognition, validation, maybe symbolic redress for survivors.
It implies that having the truth acknowledged and remembered is a vital need for them, a step towards healing or justice, even decades later.
Gives memorialization an active, almost therapeutic role for the living.
And at that book inauguration in Karen, Mr. Zemret Johannes, head of the Research and Documentation Center of the PFDJ, according to the source he spoke about the primary purpose he saw.
What did he say?
The source quotes him stating the ultimate purpose is to teach humanity a lesson so that such atrocities are never carried out again.
Framing remembrance as a powerful educational tool aimed at the future. Using past suffering to extract lessons, prevent recurrence.
Positions this specific history as a universal cautionary tale. And the source quotes Mr. Johannes making a very important distinction about the intent.
Okay.
He explicitly stated that by remembering these crimes, they are not trying to incite hatred, but rather remind people of Eritrea's history, learn from the past, and strive for a better future.
That's a crucial clarification, as presented by the source. Addresses the potential danger that remembering atrocities could fuel bitterness.
Exactly.
Instead, the stated intention is constructive. Understanding history, learning, motivating work towards a better future, using memory as a foundation for peace and progress.
Not as fuel for conflict. The source reinforces this forward-looking view, stating powerfully that memorials are as much about the future as they are about the past.
Challenges the view of memorials as just static markers. Suggests they're dynamic spaces, shaping identity, values, aspirations, guiding future actions.
Living engagements with history, not just monuments.
Yeah.
And the source explicitly links this memory, rooted in horrific violence, to a commitment to peace.
How so?
It notes that massacre sites and the memorial services for massacres have been transformed into places and events where people renew their commitment for peace.
That transformation is profound. The very locations of extreme violence, the acts of commemorating it, presented as catalysts for reaffirming dedication to peace.
Turning immense historical pain into motivation for its opposite, using the memory of atrocity as an argument for peace.
Powerful idea presented there.
Finally, the source concludes this section with a stark statement about forgetting versus remembering.
What does it say?
Quote, the perpetrators of the atrocities might have chosen to forget the massacre at Ona, Besikdira, and other places, but Eritreans cannot.
That's a powerful concluding thought on memory's burden. A sharp dichotomy.
Those who committed the acts potentially electing to forget evade guilt.
Versus those who suffered, or their descendants, for whom this history is inescapable, fundamental to their reality.
Highlights the involuntary nature of traumatic memory for those impacted and their refusal to let it be erased.
Its centrality to identity and historical understanding.
So how does the source present memorialization as active, purposeful, not just passive remembrance?
It's highly functional, deliberately intentional in the source's account. A tribute, yes, but also symbolic justice or reparation for survivors.
Right.
Critically, it's framed as a means to teach humanity a lesson for the future.
Learning from the past, striving for a better future, explicitly not inciting hatred, as Mr. Johannes stated.
And that idea that memorials are about the future, places where commitments to peace are renewed. Each is an active purpose education, reconciliation, future building, peace affirmation. A dynamic engagement.
And that emphasis on learning lessons, striving for peace, what does that tell us about how this painful history is intended to be carried forward according to the source?
It suggests a deliberate effort to shape the narrative, to prevent the past from being just a source of pain or conflict.
Transform it.
Yes, transform it into a moral foundation, a driving force for positive action, using the memory of atrocities as a motivator for building a future where such things can't happen again, harnessing painful memory for constructive goals.
This has definitely been a deep dive into a profoundly difficult, but, according to our source, exceptionally important piece of history.
And crucially, how that history is being actively remembered and documented today.
We've revisited those dates etched in memory, gone into the specific, horrifying details of Ona and Besikdira as described in the source,
Understood the vital role of documentation like Azazi's book as factual evidence.
and reflected on the many-layered active purposes of memorialization presented in the article Tribute, Justice, Learning, Peace.
Yeah.
And for you, listening, delving into difficult histories like this, guided by sources like the one we explored, it helps us appreciate the profound, long-lasting impact of conflict.
Highlights the resilience of memory against erasure, shows the ongoing human effort to document, understand lessons, and shape a better future.
It's about recognizing how history, even painful history, isn't just in books. It lives in collective memory, actively influencing the present.
Understanding how communities document, interpret, and choose to remember their most traumatic experiences offers deep insight into identity, values, aspirations.
The source leaves us with that powerful contrast: perpetrators who might choose to forget versus victims and descendants who cannot. What does that stark difference tell us about the burden of memory? Who carries it?
And thinking about the documentation, how can meticulously recording history, like this book described in the source using testimony and archives, potentially bridge that divide, or at least shape future understanding by grounding memory in evidence?
How does simply knowing these details, presented in this way, change your perspective on how history functions in the world? Something to sit with and consider.